Good morning and welcome to Exploring LDS History, where I'm doing my best every week as we walk through the history of the LDS Church together to do so in a way that's respectful, in a way that's loving, in a way that's honest. And my prayer from the very day one of this class is I want my speech to be gracious, even on issues where we may disagree with some in this room and some who will be watching later online. We may disagree vehemently on some of these issues, but I want to be as gracious in disagreeing as I can possibly be and as loving as I can possibly be as we just try to walk through the founding of the LDS Church and figure out the truth. The truth about the founding of the church, the truth about Joseph Smith and who he was, and especially his claims to be a divinely appointed prophet of God. And so thank you for being here. We left off last week towards the latter end of 1838. We're finally going to make it to 1839 this week, so it seems like we've been in 1838 for a while. We'll get to 1839, and we discussed last week the Mormon Wars of 1838 and the wars between the church and the citizens of western Missouri. And so we left off towards the tail end of that last week talking about the tragedy of the Hans Mill massacre, where on October 30th of 1838, a Missouri militia unit, without orders from anybody, totally unsanctioned, totally on their own, the morning of October 30th, they raided the small LDS community of Hans Mill and massacred, and massacre is the right word, 18 men, a couple dozen wounded. This was not a battle in any kind of war sense. It was very much murder, where they were shooting down unarmed men and unarmed boys, and they laid waste to that little community. And that's where we left off last week. So we'll pick up there this week on the same day that the Hans Mill massacre happened. The sanctioned militia that had been sent by the governor, the sanctioned militia that was acting under orders, began to mass at Far West. Whereas part of this, the saints, as they've been driven from different communities, everybody had kind of fallen back to Far West as the last bastion for the saints. That militia, acting under Governor Boggs' extermination order, began to amass at Far West. Smith received word of what had happened already that day at Hans Mill. So by the end of the day, the Missouri Army numbered more than 2,500, with many, many more coming and not very far out. The saints in Far West had an army of less than half of that number, most of whom were very poorly armed, many of whom didn't even have guns. They had homemade swords and pitchforks and whatever weapons they had been able to throw together. And so Smith sees this army amassing. And just as a reminder, we looked at this last week. This was the order that Governor Boggs had sent to the state militia to carry out. It's very famously known as the extermination order now, because it contained these words, that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and they must be exterminated. That is a strong word, right? And I think Governor Boggs lived to regret that word, that one word. They must be, it's one thing to say they're our enemies. It's another thing to say, go exterminate our enemies or drive them from the state if necessary. So this militia is gathering at Far West to carry out that extermination order from the governor. So as soon as they see the army encamped, Smith sent out Reed Peck in hopes of negotiating a compromise. He meets with the general and comes back with the good news that at least they said they will hold off the attack until tomorrow morning while the rest of the troops are coming in. So they got a reprieve at least for the night. On that night, this is what Smith told his men, and they'd done their best to throw up fortifications and ramparts around the city. And he told his men, I care not a fig for the coming of the troops. We've tried long enough to please the Gentiles. If we live together, they don't like it. If we scatter, they massacre us for it. The only law they know here is that might makes right. They are a damned set, and God will blast them into hell. If they try to attack us, we'll play hell with their apple carts. Before now, men, you fought like devils. But now I want you to fight like angels. For angels can whip devils. And for everyone we lack in number to match the mob, the Lord will send an angel to fight alongside. So before the troops and before his people, in public, he was very rah-rah. We've got this. This is what John Taylor, who was there that day, this is his account of it. John Taylor would go on to eventually become the third president of the church following Brigham Young, who was a very young man at the time. He said about Smith that day, "The first thing we knew, a flag of truce was seen coming toward us. Joseph Smith, our leader, then sent word back to the Missourians. Said he, 'Tell your general to withdraw his troops or I will send them to hell.'" I thought that was a pretty bold stand to take. And that is a pretty bold stand to take when you're outnumbered at least 2-1 with more army coming. But that was the face Smith put on in front of everybody. He put on a very different face in private with the people that he had sent to negotiate terms with the general. One of the young men that was there that day had sent out a letter in the days this was going on. This was kind of the attitude among the army, the troops. He said, "Come to Zion and fight for the religion of Jesus. Many a hoary head is engaged here, and the prophet goes out into battle as in the days of old. He has the sword that Nephi took from Laban. Is this not marvelous? This is great. You need to get down here and be in a part of this fight. God's going to do something awesome." So that was kind of the public face, and with his men, it succeeded, right? The Danites, especially those people that had been a part of that, they were ready to see God reap vengeance on his enemies and to see God take out this mighty Missouri army. Smith sent Reed Peck again, along with John Quarles and George Hinkle, to negotiate with the army. And privately, what he told them was very different from what he said in front of all of the troops. In private, he told them to beg like a dog for peace, because he knew this was not a fight they were going to win. Afterward, he said that he would rather go to state prison for 20 years or die himself than have the people exterminated. So in front of the troops, he's like, "We're going to get them, boys." In private, he's telling his guys that he's sending to do the negotiations, "Whatever you do, find a way to work this out," because he knew this was a fight they were not going to win. Both Reed Peck and John Quarles gave that account of the exact same words in separate accounts, that he said, "Beg like a dog for peace." Hinkle said that he ordered them to come up with a treaty on any terms short of battle. Whatever it takes to avoid a fight, work out some sort of peace, because he knew they weren't going to win a fight. So the next day, those three emissaries, they did negotiate with the general 4 terms of peace. And these were the terms of peace that General Lucas sent back to Smith. And they're tough. He said, if you want peace, if you want to avoid a fight, here's the terms. First of all, you have to turn over the Mormon leaders, Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Parley Pratt, Lyman White, and George Robinson. Immediately turn them over. And he said, you have them surrender, come to us, and after we negotiate with them, if they still want to fight, we'll send them back and we'll have at it. But you send them to us immediately. You have to financially compensate all of the non-Mormon citizens for the damages that have been done to their property in this war with the looting and ransacking that had gone on in Daviess County. You have to leave the state immediately. And this is thousands of LDS church members. So you have to turn over your leaders, pay financial compensation, and leave Missouri. And give up all of your arms and all of your weapons. So that is really tough terms. But Smith knew he didn't have any choice but to comply. Lucas gave him 1 hour to comply or we're attacking. So he sent back those terms and said, you've got an hour, and then he only waited 30 minutes and he started amassing his troops. So he was not fooling around There was not going to be an extension. So, as soon as the army started to amass in front of the city, Smith sent Hinkle and Corll back out under a white flag to inform General Lucas that Smith and the leaders were turning themselves in and that they were on their way. So later that day, Smith did turn himself in, but before he did, this was the speech he gave to his men before he surrendered. He told his troops, "You are good and brave men, but there are 10,000 men approaching far west, and unless you were angels themselves, you couldn't withstand so formidable a host. You've stood by me to the last. You've been willing to die for me for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and that's offering enough in the sight of God. The bloodthirsty Lucas has demanded my surrender, and I shall offer myself up as a sacrifice to save your lives and to save the church." So he says his farewell to his men, and Smith turned himself in along with the other leaders that had been demanded. They were taken prisoner. They were not treated particularly well. That night they were forced to sleep out on open ground while it rained. And Lucas came to them at midnight and said, "We've held a court-martial. The court-martial has determined that you're guilty of treason, and you're all going to be executed at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." And to which Lyman White's the guy on the bottom right there. He was one of the apostles. He was spunky. He was a fighter. Lyman White apparently spat back, "You can thank Joe Smith that you're not in hell this night. For if it hadn't been for him, by God, I would have put you there myself." So they get word they're going to be executed the following morning. And this is where it gets interesting. Lucas commanded Major General Alexander Doniphan to carry out that order. So his brigade was given the command to carry out the execution order. Doniphan, you might remember him. Does he look a little familiar? Doniphan was one of the best. He was a member of the Missouri State Legislature at the time. He was a lawyer. He had been one of the best friends the Mormons had. He had worked out the deal that allowed them to have Caldwell County as kind of a refuge county for them to live in. He'd done everything to help them that he could. He'd done everything to keep peace that he could between Mormons and the old settlers. And now he's part of the state militia, and he's given this order to have them executed. And he refused to follow that order. When the lines had been formed that morning, he came to the prisoners and he told them, "By God, you've been sentenced by the court-martial to be shot this morning, but I will be damned if I will have any of the honor of it or any of the disgrace of it. I've ordered my brigade to take up the line to march and to leave the camp, for I consider this to be cold-blooded murder." And I agree with him. And kind of his thinking was, this is not right because, first of all, a court-martial is not legal because these guys are not military, so they're not subject to a court-martial. And this is just, you're bloodthirsty and you want their heads, right? There's no need to execute these men. So I think Doniphan was exactly right, but the guts it took for him to do this, and understanding this is state militia, right? This is not regular troops. This is, weekend warrior guys. You've all been called out. That, they were farming last week, and now they're in the army this week. And so it's not that same kind of organization you'd have in regular military, but still the courage it took for him to stand up to General Lucas, I find admirable, because it's very easy to just carry out your orders even if you think they're wrong and go, "I was just obeying orders," right? Just doing what I was told. And he refused to do that. In fact, this is the message he sent back to General Lucas. He said, "This is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. My brigade will march for liberty tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God." And the good news for Smith and his followers in all of this is this at least gave Lucas enough pause to go, maybe I should think about this. Maybe this is not the best decision I have ever made. And he decided not to have them executed, at least right now. Right? At the time he was going, we'll execute them later. but maybe we ought to allow due process to take its course. And so he decided not to have them executed. Smith, meanwhile, in the middle of all this, had sent back word back into Far West, telling his people to surrender. So that same day, all the Mormon troops exited the city, laid their weapons on the ground, and a lot of tension here, because everybody was half convinced they're all going to be shot on the spot when they go to surrender. I don't know if you've ever seen The Outlaw Josie Wales. Is in my top 5 movies of all time, the greatest Western ever made. If you haven't seen it, you got to watch The Outlaw Josie Wales. But anyway, in it, Clint Eastwood's band of Confederates that they've held out to the end. Right after the Civil War's over, they held out, they've held out, they've held out. They finally agree to go in and they surrender. They lay down their arms and they open up a Gatling gun on them, right? And they just mow them down. The people in Far West were very concerned that that is exactly what was going to happen when they turned themselves in. Fortunately, that didn't happen. There was no violence. They surrendered all of their arms. But then General Lucas did march his entire force of 2,500 men through the streets of Far West, mocking and laughing and jeering at the Mormons, all along the way, as they did. But violence was avoided, and with that, the Missouri War of 1838 was over. Smith and the others were taken by a prison wagon to Independence, Missouri, to await trial. And that was about a 5-day trip back to Independence, where this all started in Missouri, back in Jackson County, which is supposed to be Zion, where Jesus is going to return, where the New Jerusalem is going to be built. They go back there to await trial, and for the next week, the remaining troops would plunder Far West. It's not really certain how bad the plundering was, but it did occur. A lot of the accounts are probably very exaggerated to how bad it was and how much went on, but for a week, the troops were in town, and they did plunder the saints that remained. During that week, 60 additional Mormon men were arrested, and Major General Clark, who was part of that group that was left there and remained, before they left, he gathered all of the men left in Far West and gave them this speech before he withdrew his troops. He said, "The orders of the governor to me were that you should be exterminated." And again, there's that word again. Right? They had carte blanche, right? That my orders from the governor were to wipe you guys out. We're doing you a favor. And that you not be allowed to remain in the state. So you must not think of staying here another season or of putting in crops. For the moment you do, the citizens will be upon you. As for your leaders, their doom is already sealed. You have been the aggressors. You have brought upon yourselves these difficulties by being disaffected and not being subject to rule. And my advice is that you become as other citizens, lest by recurrence of these events you bring upon yourselves the irretrievable ruin. So he made very clear to them, you guys have got to leave. You can't stay here. Joseph Smith, in the meantime, he's being transported to Liberty Jail just before he got there, or to Independence, just before he got there 5 days later. We have this letter that he wrote to Emma, his wife, while he was en route. He said to Emma, "Oh, Emma, for God's sake, do not forsake me, nor the truth, but remember, if I do not meet you again in this life, may God grant that we meet again in heaven. I cannot express my feelings. My heart is full. Farewell, oh my kind and affectionate Emma. I am yours forever, your husband and true friend." And he wrote that not knowing if he was going to live or die at the end of all of this. And I find it interesting, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure what to make of some of Smith's correspondence with Emma, because this is a very tender, very affectionate letter here. But we know he was fooling around on Emma. At this point, they haven't officially worked out all the kinks on celestial marriage and polygamy, but he was already fooling around on her with several other women. But she hung in there with him. I don't know the specifics of what their relationship was like. I would like to know. But at the same time, you have this tender side that you see, this very affectionate side between he and Emma. And so we see that as he's on his way to jail. When they get to Independence, Smith learned he was going to stand trial in Richmond for treason, arson, murder, burglary, robbery, larceny, perjury. Basically, the state was throwing every charge at him they could think of at this point, right? And you're just adding them all on. But treason's the biggie. And then we're going to add all these other charges. Not long after they got there, Rigdon came down with a fever, which brought back he was prone to, they called them nervous spasms and fainting spells. I don't know if maybe he was epileptic or exactly what was going on there. But he had these spells where he would have spasms and he would pass out. And so the guards just mocked him mercilessly for that while they were in prison. And telling them all tales, probably exaggerated tales about what they were doing back in Far West to his people. So they're just kind of mocking him. And after a few nights, Smith had had all of that he could take. And this is partly Pratt's account, who was one of the ones in prison with Smith. Pratt said that one night Smith had had enough, and he got up and confronted the guards, and he said, "Silence, you fiends of the infernal pit." Nobody says things like that anymore. "Silence, you fiends of the infernal pit. In the name of Jesus Christ, I rebuke you and command you to be still. I will not live another minute and hear such language. Cease such talk, or you or I die this instant." And with that, the guards were sufficiently embarrassed, I guess, or humbled by their actions, and they quieted down and they turned away and they left him alone. And that left an impression on Pratt, who said afterwards, he said, "I've seen ministers of justice clothed in magisterial robes, and I've seen criminals arraigned before them while life was suspended on a breath. But dignity and majesty have I seen but once, as it stood in chains at midnight in a dungeon in an obscure village in Missouri." Well, at least according to Pratt, that left quite an impression on him. At the preliminary hearing 5 days later, Smith was horrified to learn that the presiding judge was going to be Austin King, a man who had been very vocally anti-Mormon. And he knew as soon as he found out who the judge was that he was not going to get a fair shake in trial. And in truth, he didn't. Witnesses that the state introduced included longtime dissenters, people like John Whitmer and W.W. Phelps. But he was shocked to see among the state's witnesses were George Hinkle, John Correll, and Reed Peck, the three men that he had sent to negotiate terms of surrender. And now they have turned state's witness. And we see this same thing happen all the time, right? Watergate, everybody involved in Watergate vowed to secrecy and to never tell until it started coming out, and then everybody started making plea deals as fast as they could, right? We see it happening right now with the events of January 6th. People involved in that are going, "No jail time, I'll tell you everything I know," right? And so the same thing was happening here. They had decided, they're taking plea deals to tell what they knew. But what shocked Smith the most and what hurt Smith the most is when Samson Avard was brought into the courtroom. If you remember Samson Avard from a couple weeks ago, he was the head ringleader of the Danites, been the biggest investigator in a lot of the stuff that had been done by the Mormons themselves, and he totally took a deal to save his own neck and spilled his guts and told everything he knew about the Danites and the expulsion of the dissenters and how they had looted Daviess County and the constitution of the Danites, and said Smith was aware of all of it, and he just coughed up everything. The witnesses also testified that Smith had taught the Mormon Church would one day destroy all governments. Again, what's the charge they're trying to make stick? Treason, right? And so that's the case that the government's trying to make. And this is kind of the tricky thing for me. Had Smith made statements saying that one day the Mormon Church would destroy all governments? Sure, lots of them. Some of them are recorded in their scripture, right? He made all kinds of statements saying one day the church is coming down and it doom and gloom, but not in the sense of, not in the treasonous sense of we are anti-government, we're going to throw the government down, we're leading a rebellion against the United States. More in that religious sense of Jesus is going to come back and all this is going to happen and you need to get right with Jesus now. And so he had made those kind of statements that look bad when you take them out of that kind of context, but it wasn't like he was leading a campaign against the U.S. government. And so in my mind, I think it was more like we have some of these groups in Idaho and whatever that are very anti-government now, right? And they're very vocal about it, but they're not leading an active campaign to take the United States down or anything like that. Donovan, who was now acting again as the lawyer for the Mormons, tried to get witnesses for Joseph Smith on the stand, and he got frustrated because every time he would name a witness, they would go down and hunt down that witness and arrest him. And so he had trouble getting any witnesses for Smith. In the end, they could manage only 6 witnesses to take the stand for Joseph Smith. And Donovan said at the time, if a cohort of angels were to come down and declare you innocent, it would make no difference, for King is determined to see you in prison. And so Smith and his men probably didn't get a really fair shake. In the end, Judge King ordered all but 11 of the Mormon prisoners to be released or permitted bail. Of the 11, 4 were sent to Richmond jail, while 6 others, the ringleaders, including Smith and Rigdon and Pratt and Smith's brother Hiram, they were all remanded to the Liberty Jail in Clay County to await trial. Somehow in all of this dragnet from the state, only 3 of the church's leaders escaped being arrested. Brigham Young, who was very competent and capable. I don't know how he managed to not be arrested, but he didn't. Edward Partridge, he was on the Quorum of 12, but he was a very gentle, peacemaking man. And Heber Kimball, who was just kind of goofy. They didn't get arrested, but so somehow Young avoided it, and that's going to be very important for the Mormons that he did. So Smith entered Liberty Jail on November 30th, 1838, with those other 5, and you can see they were not first-class accommodations that they were kept in. He would spend the next 4 months in Liberty Jail until the spring of 1839. And Smith used that time to write a series of letters to his people, and he understood he was on trial before his people as well. All right, their leader has been arrested, and a lot of them were saying, is he a false prophet? What's going on? So he's writing to defend himself of his innocence, and this is just a witch hunt by the state. They're out to get me. Does that sound familiar? I hear that a lot from somebody lately. This is all just a witch hunt. They're all out to get me, and I'm innocent of all of these charges. And so he's defending himself. Fortunately, he had Brigham Young in his corner, who did yeoman's effort fighting for him in Far West among the people and defending him among the people, including Smith's ever-problematic brother, William, who pops up again. I'll say this for Smith, whatever else he was so loyal to family. William was in the 12 and out of the 12 and in the 12. He was in leadership positions and then on the out so many times, I don't even know how many times, but this is one of them where he's running around saying at the same time his brother was a false prophet. And he said, if I had the disposing of my brother, I would have hung him years ago. So Brigham Young's dealing with all of this back in Far West while Smith was in prison. And then on March 20th, in 3 days in March in 1839, Smith wrote what is probably his most famous letter to his followers. You may have heard of it. It's usually referred to as the letter from Liberty Jail. It's a long letter. You can find the whole thing online if you want to read it. 17 pages in this letter where he goes on writing to his people, defending himself denouncing the charges, giving instructions to his people who've already had to move on about where they're going to purchase land, and taking care of administrative matters. Parts of it have been canonized now. They're in Doctrine and Covenants 121, 122, and 123. And this is a very important letter, and I know 17 pages. I'd bore you to tears if I read it all. But I am going to try to read you 3 sections to give you a flavor of it that kind of reflect the content of this letter and where Smith's mindset was at the time. Part that's recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 121 today, Smith said, "They who charge thee with transgressions," this is God speaking. That's why it was later canonized as Scripture. So it's first person in the letter. "They who do charge thee with transgression, their hope will be blasted, and their prospects shall melt away as the hoar frost melteth before the burning rays of the rising sun. In not many years hence, they and their posterity shall be swept from under heaven, saith God, that not one of them is left to stand by the wall." So we've heard this kind of language before, right? It's always God's wrath is coming in a little bit, in a little bit, in a little bit. They're going to get what's coming to them. "Cursed are all of those that shall lift up the heel against mine anointed, saith the Lord, and cry, they have sinned when they have not sinned before me," talking about the charges against him, "and have done that which was meet in my eyes and which I commanded them to do." You do see a lot of this in the letter too, where Smith is going, I don't know why all this has happened, but I do know this is true. "Hell may pour forth its rage like the burning lava of Mount Vesuvius or of Etna or of the most terrible of the burning mountains, and yet shall Mormonism stand. Water, fire, truth, and God all are the same. Truth is Mormonism." And so he's drawing a line in the sand there. And I do find it's interesting that today church members would prefer not to be referred to as Mormons or the Mormon church, but the early leaders of the church were very comfortable using that term with regard to themselves. God is the author of it, and He is our shield, and it's by Him we received our birth. It was by His voice that we are called to a dispensation of His gospel in the beginning of the fullness of times, and it was by Him we received the Book of Mormon, and it was by Him that we remain unto this day, and by Him we shall remain, if it shall be for our glory and in His almighty name. One other little interesting snippet that I think is interesting, he does share in his letter about their attempts to escape jail, and they almost did. He says, "We got so close, and they had augers smuggled into them, and they'd been trying to get out through the stone walls of the prison, and we almost made it, but the friend who had come to visit him kind of gave him away because he was acting very nervous and skittish, and he got him caught, even though he was there to try to help him." He says, "We applied to a friend, and a very slight unconscious act gave rise to some suspicion, and before we could fully succeed, our plan, it's hard to read this with no punctuation, before we could fully succeed, our plan was discovered. We had everything in readiness, but the last stone, and we could have made our escape in 1 minute and should have succeeded admirably had it not been for a little imprudence over anxiety on the part of our friend. The sheriff and jailer did not blame us for our attempt, and it was a fine breach, and it cost the county a round sum to fix it. But public opinion says that we ought to have been permitted to have made our escape. And remember that then the disgrace would have been on us, but now it must come on the state." And here he's very perceptive. He is not wrong. Because by March of 1839, public opinion had turned, and public opinion had changed. And public opinion was swinging very much in favor of the Mormons by that time. There was a newspaper called The Republican, and this was all local western Missouri when it went down, but news gets out, right? And a newspaper called The Republican had reported the horrors of the Hans Mill massacre, which was horrible. And that news had gotten out, and that had generated a lot of sympathy for the Mormon cause. They'd also published the details about what happened in Daviess County. And it's reprehensible that after they ran the Mormons out, they went into Adam and Andi Aman, and here's a ready-made town, right? We've read There's houses already built and mills half built and things under construction. And they went in and just sold off all of that for $1.85 an acre, including all the improvements on the land. Right? So they came in and swept up the Mormons' property for nothing. And they reported on all of that. And Governor Boggs now is kind of going, by this point, wish I wouldn't have said extermination. Wish I wouldn't have used that choice of words, right? Because now the public is clamoring to know what went down. What did you order, Governor Boggs? What all happened here? And so a state Senate committee was appointed to look into it, and Governor Boggs finally turned over all the papers related to the Mormon War to the Turner Committee. And that committee immediately knew they had a political hot potato in their hands that they didn't want to deal with. Because the evidence made clear that the attempts trying to prove the Mormon leaders guilty of treason was flimsy at best. The Mormons had certainly been wrong in a lot of their actions, but people on both sides had been wrong in a lot of their actions. But certainly not treasonous, and they knew that their evidence was very flimsy. Any burning and pillaging done by the Mormons, which there had been, but all of that, there hadn't been cold-blooded murder like Hans Mill, where they just went in and mowed down innocent people. So that looked bad. And the extermination order from a public perspective, public opinion perspective, that stunk to high heaven. And the last thing they wanted was that getting out in public opinion, right? So the state of Missouri had a problem on their hands. And so in the end, I read one historian who said it's one of the greatest cases of whitewashing in all of American history, because they just swept it all under the rug in the end, and downplayed all of the events altogether. And they ended up in December, the legislature did appropriate $2,000 in funds, which is to what they needed is a piddly amount, right, to move thousands of people. But it's a wink and a nod gesture. We'll try to help them. They appropriated $2,000 to aid the saints in leaving the state. Meanwhile, so all that's going on legally with Joseph's case. Back in Far West, Brigham Young, they'd found a new leader, and Brigham Young stepped up, and he had the foresight to develop a plan to get the saints out of Missouri. Think about the logistic problem of moving 10,000 people in 1834. Just think about logistically what a headache it is for you to move today. Right? We thought about selling our house and moving, and I said, it's just too much work. I don't want to do it. Right? And all I have to do is get a U-Haul and back it up and stick all my stuff in it and drive, right? And think about some of these saints. They were converted and they moved to Kirtland. And they moved from Kirtland to Missouri. And now they're being forced to move again. Some of them had moved to Independence. They'd been run out of Independence. They'd moved to Caldwell. They moved from, from Independence to Clay County to Caldwell County, and now being forced to move again. And just think about logistically that nightmare. You know, some of you have moved a bunch in the military or whatever, but even then, my understanding, if the military does it for you if you want them to, right? A truck just shows up at your house and they carry your stuff away and you drive to your new house and there it is. They had none of that. And Young starts to show glimpses of who he would become, right? And I think the church survives today due to Brigham Young. After Smith's death, he had the foresight and the plan to get him out here to Utah. But in this case, he came up with a plan to get him out of Missouri, where he had the foresight to plan ahead and send out people ahead of him that laid up supplies and stores of corn and stuff they would need along the way to get them there. And he begins moving. And most agree, 8,000 to 10,000 Mormons left Missouri en route to, they would land in Commerce, Illinois. So he's back in Far West dealing with all of that. Meanwhile, back in prison, Smith was allowed to have visitors occasionally. One of them was this man who you might recognize. Porter Rockwell is famous, not just in Mormon history, in the history of the Western United States. He's up there with Wyatt Earp and Bill Hickok and Billy the Kid and all of those famous gunfighters. He had become a convert to Mormonism, and he started hanging around the Liberty Jail and would get food into them and keep them informed on local happenings and public opinion and what was going on. And he was just always around. He's an interesting figure. I just ordered a biography of him this week because I want to find out more about him. If you don't know, Porter Rockwell becomes kind of the avenging angel of the church under Brigham Young when they get here. He would go on to become Joseph Smith's bodyguard, and when Joseph Smith died, he would be Brigham Young's bodyguard. And he was Brigham Young's enforcer when they got to Utah. Interesting man. Gunslinger, great gunfighter, and fiercely bulldog loyal to Joseph Smith and to Brigham Young. Would do whatever they said. And this is the first time he pops into our story. I don't know if we'll have time to get to it later, so just real quick. Maybe later we'll come back to this, but I don't know if it'll happen. 3 years later, Governor Boggs, who was then ex-Governor Boggs of Missouri, was sitting in his study one evening reading, and somebody shot him through the window of his home. Severely, severely wounded him, nearly killed him, but he did go on to recover. There's pretty strong evidence that Porter Rockwell was the trigger man acting on orders from Joseph Smith to get to avenge how he had treated them in Missouri. Maybe we'll come back to that in a bit. But Porter Rockwell's fascinating if you want to look into his character. Fascinating guy, and he looks scary. Like, if he had a gun, I wouldn't mess with him, right? So he was very effective at his job. Also, Emma and 6-year-old Joseph Smith III were able to visit Smith on their way to Illinois. And he did really good, bucked up in prison, but grew incredibly depressed after they had left. He lost faith in Donovan. It's just dragging out. Everything drags out legally, and he was frustrated with Donovan always telling him everything's been postponed and pushed back. And that led to 2 separate prison break attempts. The one we read about, one other attempt, they had decided between them, we're going to overpower the guards. And they tried to do that when there were some people in there visiting them. And they got in the way, and one of the guards got out and slammed the door before they could do anything. And so that one kind of fizzled. But they decided, we don't like it in here. The one who didn't like it the most, though, was Sidney Rigdon. And this is interesting to me because before prison, right, if you've been here the last few weeks, you know, he was the most outspoken, the most bombastic, the most we're going to mow them all down and slay our enemies of all of them. He far more involved with rhetoric that was over the top than Smith ever was. And more than any of them, he just fell apart in prison. And his frequent physical problems and fits were filled with long periods of whining about how hard it all was. And he said, it's worse for me than it ever even was for Jesus. And I mean, just, right? And his cellmates, Smith and Pratt and the others, they got sick of listening to his whining. And so when Donovan finally arranged to get his release in February, they were glad to see Rigdon go. And he turned out to be a bit of a wuss when things got tough. So he was released in February, and he did make his way to join the saints who were gathering in Illinois. But his relationship with Smith would never be the same after that. He remained as part of the first presidency, and he is there. But he was in day-to-day decisions when they get to Illinois. Rigdon was not involved like he had been in Kirtland and in Missouri. All right, so as the days wore on, these guys got to be more and more an embarrassment to the local officials. And as public opinion began to change, they didn't want to bring them to trial because they were afraid of acquittal. And so they're kind of going, what are we going to do with these guys? Now we got them. How are we going to handle all of this? In April, Smith and his men were transferred back to Daviess County to stand trial for their crimes. It was kind of a farce. When the trial began, a jug was passed around the room to the point everybody was drunk, except for Smith. Smith's lawyers argued for a change of venue because they said, you cannot find 10 jurors in Daviess County who weren't a part of this war. On one side or the other, you can't find 10 people. And so they successfully argued that point, and they got a change of venue for the trial. And with that, they won Smith's freedom. And so there's correspondence back and forth with Smith and some of his followers at this point going, hey, when you find out where they're transferring you to, let us know the route and we'll bust you out along the way. But it turns out none of that was necessary. And I think this was all, best I can tell, it was all very wink, wink, nod, nod. But on their way to Boone County to stand trial, Hiram bought a jug of whiskey and generously shared it with the deputy that was transporting them. No prison wagon this time. The sheriff allowed them to purchase their own horses for this trip to Boone County. Along with the jug of whiskey, Smith offered a bribe of $800 to the deputy, but it was really a thing. They were more than willing to let them go, right? It was about half we're going to not look, and we're going to let you go, and about half escape, I think. Because conveniently that night, about 25 miles from Amman, the guard conveniently got drunk and conveniently fell asleep. And when he did, Smith and his men jumped on their horses and rode to Far West, where they joined the last of the Mormons that were leaving for Illinois. And again, I get the impression it was about 50% escape and about 50% we'll let you escape and get this problem out of our hands, because they didn't know what to do with them at that point. So Smith would join his people in Commerce, Illinois, where they were amassing, in Commerce, Illinois would soon be known by a new name that you might be familiar with. Smith would christen Commerce, Illinois as Nauvoo. And in a few years, Nauvoo would be the second largest city in all of Illinois, behind only Chicago. And so we will pick up the story there next week. All right, so thanks for joining us today. If you have any questions, I can hang out for a minute, but let me pray, and we can be dismissed for this week. Lord Jesus, thank you so much again for your goodness, and as always, Lord, help us to leave today grateful for your truth, Lord, for the gospel, Lord, for the privilege of knowing you and knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that our sins are forgiven and that we are free, and that it's not by our righteousness and it's not by our works. And we are just so thankful today for your mercy and for your grace. And we pray these things in your name. Amen.